We're celebrating the 6-year anniversary of this podcast, talking about how my thought leadership has evolved as I switch roles and Diane Diaz interviews me on this episode of the Speaking Your Brand podcast. More and more women are making an impact by starting businesses, running for office, and speaking up for what matters. With my background as a TV political analyst, entrepreneur, and speaker, I interview and coach purpose-driven women to shape their brands, grow their companies, and become recognized as influencers in their field. This is Speaking Your Brand, your place to learn how to persuasively communicate your message to your audience. Hi there, and welcome to the Speaking Your Brand podcast. I'm your host, Carol Cox. This episode is celebrating 6 years of the Speaking Your Brand podcast. I cannot believe that has been 6 years. This is episode 318. If you had told me when I started this podcast in February of 2017 that it would still be going strong 6 years later, I may not have started it. No, I really would have started. That's what we're going to talk about today. Joining me is Diane Diaz, our lead speaking coach. Hi, Diane.
Hello, Carol. Congratulations.
Well, thank you so much. And you've been on the podcast, of course, a number of times, including in episode number 2. So the very beginning of the podcast.
Yes. I forgot about that.
Yes, you're on. And so I invited you here today because I want you to interview me. So we're flipping roles. I'm usually, of course, the one interviewing people on the podcast, but I'm going to be one being interviewed. So we can talk about how my thought leadership has evolved over the years, because that's the thing that I feel like with the women we work with is to let them know that your thought leadership is not one thing that you create. Say when you're working with us in the Thought Leader Academy, it is set, you inscribe it in stone, and then you never change it again. We all evolve as human beings. And so our thought leadership message and what we talk about evolves as well. So that's what we're going to be diving into today. So Diane, I'm going to hand the interview reins over to you.
Oh, how exciting. All right. Well, then let's get started. What did you like to do when you were a little girl? Let's start there.
I love this question. I loved to read books for sure. My nose was always in a book. All my family members would tell you that that's probably the visual they have of me is sitting on the couch reading a book. I would read novels like Sweet Valley High when I was in middle school and Nancy Drew, and then graduated to other books. And then, so I would say definitely reading. But the other thing that I really loved to do is I loved to run around the neighborhood. Again, thinking like later elementary school, middle school years. My sister and I would ride our bikes all over town at very young ages. And we would climb trees. We would go into the dried up canals. Like we would just have so much fun exploring.
Typical Florida girl behavior, right?
Yes, exactly.
Let's talk about the start of your thought leadership journey. Why did you start the podcast so long ago, 6 years ago?
I started the podcast because I love the medium of podcasting. And this is what I recommend to women who come to us and inquire about whether they should start a podcast. And I say, you really should love the medium of podcasting to have a podcast because it is a lot of work and it is a labor of love. I've been listening to podcasts since 2008, 2009, when I would have to plug in my iPod to my laptop, transfer the podcast episodes from the laptop into the iPod, and then I would plug the iPod into my car to listen while I was driving. But back in the day, there was no easy USB connector. I had like this fancy FM tuner device that would hook up the FM radio to the iPod to get it to play through the speakers. That's how dedicated I was to listening to podcasts. And I loved them. I learned so much. I really felt like I knew the podcast host who I listened to every single day, every single week. And it's such an intimate medium. So when I started Speaking Your Brand, the company in 2015, I knew that I wanted to eventually start a podcast. And 2016 was very busy because of the election year and having to go on TV so much. So I knew 2016 was not the year. But as soon as 2017 rolled around, I knew that it was time to launch the podcast. And that's what I did.
And I can attest to the fact that you love podcasts because you are the one that turned me on to podcasts. I honestly wasn't even really sure what a podcast was until you started Speaking Your Brand. And then I started listening to that and you kept referring me to other podcasts. And I call you my podcast pusher because you push all these podcasts on me and then I become addicted to them. So, but it's been really fun to watch the Speaking Your Brand podcast grow. So for you, what has it been like to podcast and create this content to be a podcast for 6 years straight. What has that felt like?
It doesn't feel like it's been 6 years at all. It felt like it's been maybe a couple of years. I honestly don't know where the 6 years have gone. It has been the best thing I've ever done for the business. But I would say even more than that, it's the best thing that I've done for myself and understanding my own thought process, the ideas that matter to me, and then getting them out into the world. And I know we'll talk about this, but getting them out into the world, even when they feel unfinished, even when I'm not sure what the end is going to look like with that idea or that thought that I have, but I'm willing to put it out there anyways. And so I feel like for me with the podcast is that it has helped me so much to literally think out loud the different things that I'm working on.
To that point, what has been the benefit of that? So when you're creating a podcast episode, it helps you think through your topics, but also what have been the benefits, not just to your messaging, but also to the business? How has it benefited that?
For sure, the podcast is our best attractor of clients. I know that, and for those of you listening, and if you've been a client, you know this is the case. You find the podcast, maybe someone recommends it to you, or you've done a search and a podcast episode comes up. And I hear from you that you listen to that first episode and then you end up binging a whole bunch of them. And I understand that feeling because I do the same thing when I find a new podcast that I really like. So many women binge or listen to a few episodes and then they really like what we talk about on the podcast. So then they come to us and want to work with us. And I love clients who have listened to the podcast because I feel like they really get not only just the kind of what it is that we do around thought leadership and public speaking, but really the mission that we have to amplify and champion diverse women's voices and to encourage more women to put themselves out there.
Has doing the podcast then for you personally, it made you feel more empowered as you hear these other women's stories and you help share them?
Oh, absolutely. I have so enjoyed getting to know all of the women that we've worked with, all of the women who've come on the podcast. Most of the women who've been guests on the podcast are clients, have been clients, because of course it's women that are in our ecosystem, they're in our community, so we know them. So I end up inviting them on the podcast because I want more of the world to hear about their message and about the work they do and about their stories. And so for sure, hearing them has helped me to see not only the variety of messages and stories that are out there, but how sharing our experiences helps us to feel not alone in the world.
That's such a good point. Well, and so speaking of that, then I know that we hear this from a lot of clients that, when you're first putting your message out, whether it be through a podcast or your signature talk or whatever method you're using to do that, but especially these more personal ones, like actually literally speaking, it can be a little nerve-wracking and it can certainly stir up feelings of fear and maybe even imposter syndrome. So talk a little bit about the fears as maybe you've experienced them or that you've seen kind of stepping into your thought leadership, like delivering a message that you think, ooh, people need to hear this, but I'm not sure if they want to. It might ruffle some feathers. What if they don't like it? So talk a little bit about what experience has been like and maybe how you've kind of managed that.
Yes, this is such a good question. And I'm glad that we're talking about this because I feel like not only do we personally, you and I experience this, but many women do, many of the women that we've worked with. And it can feel scary and uncertain to put things out into the world that maybe is different than what people expect, especially that people expect from you or the things that you're used to doing or used to saying. But of course, that's exactly where the power is because then whoever's on the receiving end is probably going to pay a little bit more attention because they're not used to hearing that. So I will say that definitely my thought leadership has evolved. The first 25 episodes of the Speaking Your Brand podcast, so half of a year, were all interviews with women, many of them clients, but with women. I didn't do a solo episode until episode 25. Hard to believe, but literally I did not know what to do a solo episode on. I was thinking, I don't know, like what should I talk about in the podcast? So eventually, obviously, I figured that out. And it's the process of thinking every single week, what is it that listeners are going to benefit from? What can I share with them, teach them, explain to them, inspire them with that's going to not only obviously keep them coming back to the podcast, but help them with what they want to do with their business and put out into the world. And so I definitely have experienced those vulnerability hangovers as we did a whole episode on vulnerability hangovers because it happens whether you're doing a speaking event, you're being interviewed on someone else's podcast, or you host your own podcast. There will come a time, and I say hopefully because there should come a time where you feel that little sense of, oh, I don't know if I should have said that. Now, I don't know if I should have said that because you said something about someone else, which you should not do. As I like to say, you own your own story, they own their story, they can tell their story. But if your own story, your own experience, if you get to the point where you're feeling that vulnerability hangover, that's probably a good thing, as hard as it feels in the time. And I'll point to a few episodes, since we are specifically talking about the podcast, where I have definitely felt that. The first one was in episode 92. So it's way back and towards the end of 2018. So about a year and a half into the podcast. And I shared the TEDx talk that I gave in 2016 called Why We're Uncomfortable with Women in Power. But I also shared how badly that talk went. And so I wanted to share the message that was in there, but really the point of that was to share that I'm not perfect. As a speaking coach, as the owner of a public speaking company, I'm not a perfect speaker. We all make mistakes. So I wanted to get that across. But that definitely, my thought was, wow, well, people think that I'm just completely not good at the work that I do if I share that I didn't do well at a speaking engagement, but quite the contrary. That would be one. The other one was in actually a few weeks after that, episode 97, I had a client of mine, Geraldine Carter, interview me about thinking bigger. And so she kind of pressed me a lot on, how I could think bigger about the work that I was doing. So that felt very vulnerable to get coached by her on air on the podcast. And then the other ones that come to mind are, I know we did our Brave Bull Beyond live virtual summits, and we ended up sharing our talks from those summits on the podcast. And that's, those were not political in the sense of like, we weren't talking about electoral politics, but they were very kind of like women's consciousness raising type of talks. And of course, I feel like our audience is receptive to that, but still that could have been, ruffle some feathers. But then the big one was the one that I did in August of 2020, episode 185. I actually titled it My Journey as a Thought Leader and How We're Evolving at Speaking Your Brand. But the episode had nothing to do with thought leadership and had nothing really to do with how we're evolving at speaking your brand. That was the planned title and episode until I sat down to record it. And I ended up telling the story about my dad and him dying when I was in college, very unexpectedly, and kind of the journey that I went through with that and what it taught me, growing up. And again, it had nothing to do with business, but it was a story that mattered to me. I felt like I had built up enough like camaraderie on the podcast with podcast listeners that I felt safe sharing that with them, that I could trust them with such a personal story. Yet, oh my God, that morning when I knew that episode went live, I was really nervous about it.
Yeah. So Carol, first of all, thank you for sharing all of those incidents where you shared content that it speaks to that point of that these are important things to put out there in the world. And sometimes, some people on the receiving end of it might not enjoy it as much as you had hoped or feel some kind of a way about it. But particularly with that episode about your dad, and I remember that episode, I know, you were probably having that vulnerability hangover, but how did you sort of manage that feeling? What did you say to yourself? What did you tell yourself? What did you do to kind of manage? Because it's out there, then what happens? Like, how do you manage that? And also, what was the feedback that you got on that episode from listeners?
So how I manage this every time I put something out where I'm always kind of have that little bit of self-doubt about it is I tell myself, just let it sit there. Like, don't go and delete it, even though your impulse, you want to go delete it and redo it or what have you. And then I say, nope, just let it sit there and see what happens. And generally after another 24 hours, 48 hours, the feeling passes. This is why we tell our clients to put a little sticky note that it's normal to have a vulnerability hangover after sharing something personal. So just remind yourself that it will pass. It will, just let a little bit of time go by. So that's what I do. I literally just don't let myself act on the impulse of wanting to delete it or change it. The feedback, though, is also what encourages me to keep it up, but then also to keep going with it. So I got so many incredible, heartfelt well wishes from people, from listeners who said, thank you so much for sharing that story. Several of them had similar experiences with parents dying when they were young. And, and knowing, again, that's feeling that they're not alone in this, and that it's okay to, to have these emotions and to go through these things. But then I also got comments from women who said, thank you for sharing, Carol, because we know you're not perfect. And of course, I would never want to come across as perfect. Far from it. But of course, when you have a professional podcast, it's being professionally edited, and you work a lot on it. You want to put your best out there. So it does tend to come across as being not perfect, but well done. And I certainly don't want people to think my life is like that, is that curated and edited.
Yes. No, that makes sense. Have you ever had any feedback about a podcast episode that was less than positive? And if you did, like, how did you handle that? I'm just curious.
Yes. Two come to mind. The first is, this is way back in the first part of the podcast. So maybe I would say the first 6 months, definitely the first year. And I was talking about something, I think I was talking about like slides, like don't, use images on your slides. Don't use a lot of text because you want to make sure that, the audience is seeing the slides, not you reading them. And I said something like, I'm kind of a slide Nazi when it comes to this. And people say this in passing. It is completely not okay to say it. I have a master's degree in history with a focus on 20th century European history. I have, read enough and studied enough about Nazi Germany and the Holocaust to know how incredibly horrific that was. And so I should not have said it. And there was a woman who was in a community that I was part of who is Jewish. And she reached out to me privately and she said, Carol, I always love your podcast, great content, but this bothered me when you said that. And I said, I completely hear you and understand, thank you for telling me that. I don't remember if I went back and edited it out. I don't recall because it's been so long. So that was one. The second one that I remember, this is probably in the first year or two. A woman wrote to me, don't know who she is, had never heard of her before, wasn't a client. And she said, I really like your content, but I can't listen to your voice.
Wow. Personal preferences.
I get it. Some voices irritate me. It's, it is the way it is. But here's the thing, even though that was probably 5 years ago, guess what? I remember it.
Well, that's what our brains do is we key in on the negative, get 1,000 pieces of positive feedback on one negative piece. And then we key in on that and ruminate on it. And we think about it all the time. And it's just always there. So, but then I think the positive feedback does balance it out. So
It did. And I can't change my voice, really. Most people, you can't change your voice. I'm not going to pretend to be Elizabeth Holmes and talk really deep. Okay, hold on. Can I pause? Wait, can I pause here for a second? I know this is such a weird podcast episode, but I'm loving it. I just want to give a shout out to Diane, who has signed up to do a stand-up comedy set next year, early January 2023. And I'm so excited for her to do this. And I didn't push her at all.
Yeah, not at all. They can't see me, but I'm winking.
Yeah. You all can come watch the video on the show notes page of this episode if you want to see us cracking up. But really, and so the reason I say that is because humor and comedy is so important to public speaking. And we'll be talking more about this on the podcast as the year progresses and as Diane goes through working on her set.
Yes. In fact, I can just a little Easter egg, as they say, I'm already working on it. I already started jotting down a bunch of ideas and ran them past my boyfriend, and he liked a lot of them. So, and they're all personal stories, funny things that have happened to me, funny things that I say and do. So we'll see how it goes. I'm going to do it either way. So we'll see what happens. If I bomb, hey, it's not my full-time job. So
it's going to be great.
It'll be fine. Okay. So back to you, Carol. Tell me a little bit about, you were talking about, this trajectory of the podcast and how it's kind of evolved. But now for you personally, and we talk a lot about thought leadership. So how has your thought leadership evolved? What did you, at the beginning of your speaking journey, what sorts of things did you talk about? How has that shifted? What kind of brought you to where you are today?
Yeah, if I think back, to the podcast episodes, a lot of the content wise, a lot of it, stays the same. There's core things about public speaking, around personal branding, business branding, even thought leadership that we talk about. So that has been pretty consistent. I feel like what has changed the most is my willingness to put out solo episodes that are on things that are not just trainings. So, I've done a lot of episodes about here's tips to develop confidence in public speaking, or here are mistakes that speakers make and how to avoid them. So they kind of very much teaching, very tactical types of podcast episodes, which are really useful. But then I tried to intersperse those with the trends episodes that I do at the beginning of every year, which is very much me thinking about what's going on in the world and how is that going to affect us as entrepreneurs and as public speakers and thought leaders. So I think the trends episodes for sure. And the other thing is that even though we've always worked with women, women entrepreneurs has been the focus for speaking your brand. I feel like it's been in the past couple of years that it has become much more explicit, tied to our mission of wanting to amplify and champion women's voices. And I feel like a lot of that came from the work that I was doing on the book that I was working on around gender equity, gender equality, and how much public speaking and having access to the public sphere as women is so important for advancing gender equality. And that idea of public speaking and gender equality, I had not put those two together back when I started Speaking Your Brand in 2015 or the podcast in 2017. But that has evolved through the podcast content, through the podcast interviews, the podcast conversations, and also through the summits that we've held and really the Thought Leader Academy. I'll say this before I send it back to you, Diane. The whole word Thought Leader, the Thought Leader Academy, actually came from our clients. Our programs before the Thought Leader Academy were called Standout Speakers, Master Your Speaking, Monetize Your Speaking. And it was during the summer of 2020 when we really had to figure out what we're going to do with the business, since all the in-person speaking engagements had totally got canceled for everyone because of the pandemic. And we had to figure out what to do. And so we did a survey to our clients asking them, why did you come to Speaking Your Brand? What were you looking for? What were your top things that you wanted to work on? And thought leadership came out above and beyond anything else. And I had never really thought about it in those terms. And that's where I realized that our clients, they knew that that's what we were doing, but we weren't calling it that. So that's why we started explicitly talking about thought leadership and calling it the Thought Leader Academy and using speaking as one of the ways to put out your thought leadership.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I remember back to 2020 when that happened and sort of that evolution of the group going from that very tactical concept to more of this, bigger concept, bigger impact that they can have. And speaking is part of that or can be part of that. But speaking can look like whatever you want it to look like, right? It doesn't have to be speaking on a stage, fortunately, because the pandemic, right? So if we're thinking about your growth in thought leadership and this willingness to do solo episodes and to be more focused on that idea of thought leadership and sort of that bigger message, how has your confidence evolved over the time from when you started the podcast to now? And your confidence, not just in the podcast, but also just your speaking confidence, speaking about these bigger topics. How has that evolved? And also, how do you manage confidence? What strategies do you use to build up your confidence so that you can have this bigger impact with your message?
Yeah, I have a very weird relationship to confidence, to self-confidence. I feel like fortunately, I was brought up with the sense that I could do anything and that, I was good in school, so I did well. Okay, maybe not sports. Like that was definitely not a thing that I did well. But I always felt like I could do it. Like if I set my mind to it and I wanted to do it, I could be successful at it. And that has proved to be the case. So the first time I was asked to go on TV news, I said yes, even though I was scared to death, had no idea what I was doing, had no training, had no preparation. I just basically had my notes of what was going on in politics and showed up at the TV studio and answered the questions and debated with the other people who were there. So then in that sense, I've always been confident because I've always been willing just to say yes and do it. Yet I still get very nervous when I'm doing it and still have those fears and self-doubts and imposter syndrome, all of those things that come up. But I don't let that hinder me from just doing it. I recognize that those feelings exist, but then I just do it anyways. Doing the podcast, though, for 6 years has helped me in ways that I would not have even imagined to develop confidence in just expressing whatever it is that I'm feeling. As I mentioned, when I used to go on TV news, I would get really nervous. It's scary. Like you're on live TV, you don't want to mess up. You literally have 20 seconds to say something, a sound bite that sounds interesting and meaningful and get your point across. And that's all you have. And then they go to the next person and so on. So it's pretty nerve-wracking. You're in these huge studios on the sets with all the cameras and all that. So I would used to get really nervous. But now when I go on, I don't, because I'm so used to talking. It's just showing up, like doing a podcast again. Go to a speaking engagement. I used to get really nervous. Now, I still have those little butterflies, but I really don't have anywhere near the nerves that I used to because I'm so used to just talking to people and talking about things every week.
So it sounds like the confidence comes just by the doing.
Yes.
Right. So, and it's interesting because we just talked about this in our Thought Leader Academy call that we just got off of, this idea of like how to prepare for and deliver your talk. And so this idea of confidence and how do you manage those nerves and all of that came up. I was thinking about it when we were talking about it, and it just occurred to me when you said it, is that the things that I've said yes to that have been the scariest and hardest things to do that I have said yes to have given me more confidence than any amount of just straight practice that I've done. It's just the doing of the things. So for example, for you, going on the TV news, but for me, doing an Ironman, like even signing up for this stand-up thing that I'm going to do and the improv class that we took, these are things that were hard, not normally things that I would say yes to, but I said yes to them, not with no confidence that I could necessarily do it, but just with the confidence that I knew I would try. And then that gave me the confidence to know that, okay, well, maybe I'm not going to be an improv person, but it makes me more confident in my speaking.
Yes, absolutely. Improv class is a great example of something that we were not good at.
Nope.
We were not going to master.
Nope.
It was going to feel awkward every single time. And we still did it. And I'm so glad we did because it did build our confidence for in-person speaking.
Ironically, the yes and, which is improv, doing the yes and is what will build your confidence for speaking, whether that implies to improv or anything else that you do. So the yes and is what's going to get you there. Okay, Carol. So now let's wrap up. I'm going to ask you the questions that we ask everybody at the end. So I want you to share with us a favorite book of yours by, of course, a woman.
I'll share a nonfiction book and then a fiction book, even though it's really hard for me to choose. I love the author Elizabeth Gilbert. She has written both nonfiction and fiction. She's most well known for her memoir, Eat, Pray, Love. My favorite book of hers is called The Signature of All Things. Really strong female protagonist, takes place in the 1800s, has a lot to do with biology and Darwinism, seems like a really weird topic, but I've read the book twice and I will read it again. So that's a great book, The Signature of All Things. Her nonfiction book, Big Magic, I also love, have read that several times as well, but I'm not going to use that for my nonfiction slot. That was just an extra plug. Here's a book that probably listeners have not heard of and maybe seems odd, but I'm going to share and I'll explain why. It's by a woman named Holly Whitaker. The book is called, nonfiction, it's called Quit Like a Woman, The Radical Choice to Not Drink in a Culture Obsessed with Alcohol. Now, I will have an alcoholic drink once in a while. I am not in recovery. Thankfully, I do not have an addiction or anything like that. But I also recognize, because I have addiction that runs in my family, and I very viscerally understand the impact that has, that I'm very mindful of that. The reason I recommend the book, though, is not for you listeners to decide what you want to do about your alcohol intake, is because the author, Holly Whitaker, really puts herself out there. I know she's gotten a lot of criticism, a lot of backlash for the book. She puts her personal story in it front and center. So it is memoir-like, but it's backed up by a lot of research. Here's why I so applaud what she did. Is because she explicitly shows the intersections between alcohol promotion and the patriarchy, and how much alcohol has been marketed and sold to women. Mommy's little drink, right? Mommy needs a little glass of wine. Again, no judgment, right? No judgment on people. You all, decide what you want to do. But there is a reason why it's been marketed the way it has been. And the women's consumption of alcohol has risen a lot over the past 5 to 10 years. It rose a lot during the pandemic as well. And so there's a lot going on there. But the reason I recommend that book is because she explicitly talks about the patriarchy.
Fascinating. I'll have to read that one. Okay. Well, thank you for those two. So the second question is, what is a favorite movie of yours with a strong female lead?
The first one that comes to mind is Cruella. I saw the movie whenever it came out in the movie theaters. And I love the style of the movie, how stylistic it is, the music, the fashion. Of course, Cruella is, a strong female protagonist character. So it's just a fun movie. And I like to pull references to it for my talks.
I'd like to make just a plug for a movie because it is available on Netflix right now. It's The Woman King.
Yes, great movie.
It is on Netflix right now. So if you did not see that in the theater, it is on Netflix. I'm not sure how long it'll be there, but go watch it. It is amazing.
Yes, we saw that in the movie theater last year.
Yes, we did. It was fantastic.
Really good.
Finally, what is a favorite quote of yours by a woman?
This is from a novel that I read a couple of years ago. The novel is called Rock, Paper, Scissors, and the author is Alice Feeney. And I actually highlighted it in the Kindle when I was reading the book. And I rarely highlight fiction novels, but this line really stood out to me. It said, "Believing in someone is one of the greatest gifts you can give them. It's free and the results can be priceless." And I really feel like, Diane, that's what we do with the women that we work with, is we believe in them. We believe in the message they have to share. We believe that their story has value. And I know how much other people's belief in me has shaped my career and my life. And I feel like that's the way that I give back, is by believing in them.
That's so well said. That's such a great observation. I love that quote too. So thank you for sharing that. Well, let me just say thank you to you, Carol, for podcasting for 6 years. And honestly, without the podcast, I probably would not be here, because this is how we ended it. Well, we've known each other for 14 years, but the podcast is what really got me interested in starting my businesses, which is what led me to work for Speaking Your Brand. I thank you for the 6 years of podcasting and using your voice and getting over your vulnerability hangovers and sharing your stories and encouraging all the women that have come through the Speaking Your Brand doors to get their message out and have an impact with their voice in the world. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Diane, for being along with this journey. February is your 4-year anniversary officially with Speaking Your Brand. So I can't believe it's been 4 years you've been working with us. And I'm so grateful for that and all of the times you've been here on the podcast as well. And for those of you listening, if you would like to check out our Thought Leader Academy to see if it's a good fit for your goals to work on your signature talk and your thought leadership, you can do that at speakingyourbrand.com/academy. Again, that's speakingyourbrand.com/academy. We are now after this week entering Women's History Month here in the United States, the month of March. So we have a lot of great episodes coming up. Everything from the 3 stages we go through as women when we use our voice, to a guest talking about the Iranian women's revolution and more. And then in April, we have a whole series around marketing, how marketing is changing. I talked about this in that trends episode at the beginning of the year, how marketing is changing and what we all can do instead. So I'm excited for these upcoming episodes. Diane, thank you so much for doing a fantastic job interviewing me for this episode.
Well, it was my pleasure, Carol.
Until next time, thanks for listening.